The frontier was never as empty as people claimed, but it often felt that way to those who lived on its margins. In the Arizona Territory, the land stretched wide and unforgiving, painted in shades of dust, stone, and sky. Days were ruled by the sun, nights by the cold and the unknown. For settlers like Clara Whitmore, survival depended not on bravery alone, but on caution, routine, and respect for the land's moods. Clara lived just beyond the thin line that passed for civilization, a scattering of wooden buildings, a dry well that sometimes worked, and a trading post that saw more rumors than supplies. Her small homestead sat where wagon tracks faded into desert scrub. Every chore carried weight: fetching water before the heat rose, mending fences before livestock wandered, keeping her rifle clean though she hoped never to fire it. This was not the romantic West of stories. It was a place where small mistakes could cost lives. She had learned early that fear was part of frontier living. Not the sharp, screaming kind, but the quiet fear that settled into the bones. Fear of storms that arrived without warning. Fear of sickness when the nearest doctor was days away. Fear of strangers, because on the frontier, strangers often arrived desperate, armed, or both. Newspapers back east painted simple pictures of danger, but the truth was more complicated. The frontier was shaped by misunderstanding as much as violence. Clara's shyness was not weakness. It was adaptation. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she judged. After losing her parents on the trail west, she learned that loud confidence often drew trouble. Silence, on the other hand, kept her alive. She knew which paths were safe at dawn, which ravines flooded after rain, and which stories were exaggerations meant to scare lonely settlers into leaving. The land itself was the greatest teacher. It demanded patience and punished arrogance. The desert did not care who claimed ownership. It remembered every footprint, every broken promise. Long before settlers arrived, native tribes, especially the Apache, had learned to read its signs like a language. They knew where water slept beneath rock, how to travel without leaving tracks, and when to disappear rather than fight. Yet most settlers never learned this history. They inherited fear instead, passed down through warnings, half-truths, and sensational tales. Clara had heard them all: whispers at the trading post, warnings shouted across fences, stories meant to protect children but often planting deeper dread. Still, she noticed something others ignored. Many of the real dangers came not from native scouts, but from outlaws, smugglers, and desperate men hiding behind the myths. On the evening that begins this story, Clara stood at the edge of her property, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. The air was too still. Animals had gone quiet, a sign she had learned not to ignore. This moment, this pause before night, captured everything about frontier life. It was where choices mattered, where fear could either shrink a person or sharpen them. This is where the story hooks the reader, not with gunfire or shouting, but with tension rooted in reality. The frontier was a place of overlap, between cultures, between past and future, between fear and understanding. Clara did not yet know that her life was about to intersect with someone shaped by the land in a different way, but the stage was set. The edge of the frontier was not just a physical place. It was a mental one. Part 1 teaches an essential truth of the Wild West. History is rarely divided into heroes and villains. It is shaped by environment, survival, and choices made under pressure. By grounding the reader in Clara's cautious world, the story invites reflection rather than judgment. It prepares the audience to question old myths and to see the frontier not as a battlefield, but as a shared space where misunderstanding often caused more harm than intention. And as night begins to fall, the lesson is clear on the frontier. Staying alive often meant staying observant, staying humble, and above all, staying open to truths beyond fear. The trouble began with the horse. Clara had trusted the mare more than most people. She was steady, strong, and familiar with the trail that cut through the low canyon toward the trading post. Clara had taken that route dozens of times, always careful to return before dusk. But the frontier had a way of reminding people that trust was never permanent, only borrowed. The sound came first. A sharp crack of stone, then a sudden rush of wings. The mare reared, startled by something Clara never saw. In an instant, the reins slipped through her fingers, and the horse bolted forward, hooves pounding hard against the dry earth. Clara called out, but dust swallowed the sound. Within seconds, the animal disappeared into the rising shadows of the canyon. Clara stood alone. Her first instinct was panic, but years on the frontier had trained her better than that. She forced herself to breathe slowly and take stock. The sun was already sinking, and the canyon walls stretched long shadows across the path. Walking back before dark was possible but risky. The land changed at night. Familiar trails twisted, temperatures dropped, and danger moved more freely. She adjusted the shawl around her shoulders and began walking, keeping her steps measured. Every sound seemed louder now. The scrape of her boots, the whisper of wind through scrub, the distant cry of a bird settling for the night. Fear crept in, quiet but persistent. Not the kind that screamed, but the kind that whispered all the things that could go wrong. That was when she sensed she was no longer alone. It wasn't a sound, more a shift, like the land itself had inhaled. Clara stopped. Her hand tightened around the small knife at her belt, though she knew how little comfort it offered. Slowly, she turned. He stood a short distance away, half shadowed by the rocks. Tall, still, and watchful. His presence was so calm it was unsettling. He carried no raised weapon, no threatening stance. His eyes were sharp, observant, reading her the way she had learned to read the weather. And other known Apache warrior. Everything Clara had ever been warned about surged to the surface of her mind. Stories told in hushed tones. Words spoken carelessly, repeated until they hardened into truth. Her heart raced, but her feet stayed rooted. Running felt foolish. So did reaching for the knife. The man spoke first. "Do not be afraid." His voice was low and steady, accented but clear. Not a command. Not a threat. Clara swallowed. Fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. She had learned something important on the frontier. Panic invited mistakes. Silence, on the other hand, allowed space. "I lost my horse," she said finally, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. The warrior nodded, as if this explained everything. He glanced toward the darkening canyon, then back at her. "Night comes quickly here," he said. "You should not travel alone." There was no ownership in his words. No claim. Just fact. He introduced himself as Taza, a scout watching the land for signs of trouble, outlaws, smugglers, men who used fear as cover. Clara realized then how wrong many stories had been. This man was not roaming aimlessly, nor hunting settlers. He was guarding something older than fences and deeds. When he said, "Stay close this night," it was not spoken as a demand. It was offered the way one offers shelter from a storm. Clara hesitated. Everything she had been taught told her to refuse, to keep distance, to cling to fear like armor. But the frontier had also taught her another lesson. Survival often depended on choosing the least dangerous option, not the most familiar one. She nodded. They moved together toward a shallow overhang in the canyon wall, a place where the wind softened and the ground was dry. Taza showed her where to sit, how to keep the fire small enough to avoid attention. He worked efficiently, respectfully, never invading her space. As darkness settled fully, Clara realized something that surprised her more than fear ever had. She felt safe. Not because danger was gone, but because it was understood. That night did not erase her caution, nor did it turn her into someone she was not. but it cracked something open. The frontier, she began to see, was not divided simply between enemies and allies. It was filled with people shaped by necessity, doing what survival demanded. Part 2 teaches a quiet but powerful truth. First encounters are rarely what legends promise. Often they are shaped by fear, yes, but also by choice. And sometimes the bravest decision is not resistance, but trust carefully given as the fire burned low and the stars sharpened above them. Clara understood that this meeting, born of necessity, would change the way she saw the land forever. The fire was small, just as Taza had intended. Its glow barely touched the canyon walls, but it was enough to keep the cold from settling too deeply into Clara's bones. Night in the desert was honest like that, no gentle fading, no warning. Heat vanished quickly, replaced by a sharp chill that reminded anyone careless enough to forget how thin comfort truly was. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, close enough to share warmth but far enough to respect distance. Clara noticed that Taza never turned his back to the open canyon. His posture wasn't tense, only alert, the kind of awareness built over years rather than moments. Watching him, she understood that survival on this land wasn't about strength alone. It was about attention. For a long while, neither spoke. Silence in the frontier carried meaning. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was space to listen, to observe, to decide whether words were necessary. The fire popped softly, and above them the sky stretched wide, crowded with stars. Clara had seen this sky her entire life, yet it felt different tonight, as if she were seeing it through borrowed eyes. Taza broke the silence first. "You are afraid," he said gently. "But you are listening." Clara nodded. There was no point denying it. "I was taught to be careful," she replied. "Sometimes that turns into fear." Taza studied the fire before answering. "We are taught the same." That simple sentence surprised her. It cut through years of stories that had painted fear as something one-sided. She had never considered that the people settlers feared had been taught fear in return, fear of broken promises, of soldiers, of treaties signed and forgotten. As the night deepened, words came more easily. Clara spoke of her journey west, of wagons creaking across endless miles, of graves marked by stones when wood ran out. She spoke of learning to cook with little, to mend endlessly, to live quietly so the land would not notice her too much. These were not heroic stories. They were survival stories. Taza listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once, respectfully, as if receiving something of value. Then he shared his own stories. He spoke of the Apache way of knowing the land, not owning it, but belonging to it. He explained how children were taught to read the ground the way others read books. Broken twigs, shifted stones, the silence of birds. He spoke of moving lightly, of taking only what was needed, of honoring water as life itself. Clara realized how little she had been taught about the people who had lived on this land long before fences cut it into pieces. In school books and newspapers, native tribes were often flattened into obstacles or threats. Here, by firelight, she saw something fuller: families, traditions, rules shaped by centuries of trial and loss. Taza did not hide the pain of it. He spoke of treaties promised and broken, of land narrowed again and again, of children sent away to be remade into something unrecognizable. His voice did not rise with anger, but there was weight in every word. History, Clara understood, was not distant. It lived inside people. In return, she spoke of the fear settlers carried, not always rooted in cruelty, but in ignorance, of how rumors traveled faster than truth, of how desperation made people dangerous. She admitted something she had rarely said aloud. Many settlers feared losing everything because they had already lost so much just to arrive. The fire burned lower, and the night wrapped around them like a held breath. What surprised Clara most was not what they learned about each other, but how much they learned about themselves. She began to see her shyness not as weakness, but as a form of listening. Taza, she noticed, was not defined by war, but by responsibility to his people, to the land, to balance. This night was not about romance or sudden transformation. It was about understanding earned slowly, about realizing that fear, when left unexamined, becomes a story passed down like inheritance. But when questioned, it loses some of its power. Part 3 carries an important lesson for the reader. Education does not always come from books or classrooms. On the frontier, learning happened in moments like this: shared stories, quiet honesty, and the willingness to see beyond labels. As the fire finally faded into embers, Clara felt something shift inside her. The land no longer felt divided into safe and unsafe, us and them. It felt shared, complex, alive with history she was only beginning to understand. And though the night still held danger, it also held something else now. Respect. That, Clara realized, might be the strongest protection of all. The night had deepened into a velvet darkness, and the canyon around them seemed to hold its breath. Clara sat close to the dying embers of their small fire, feeling the chill settle into her bones. Sleep had been considered, but neither of them dared. Danger could arrive quietly here, and the frontier did not forgive complacency. The first hint of trouble came as a whisper, a movement too fast to be human, yet too deliberate to be wind. Clara's pulse quickened. Her hand instinctively went to her knife, then froze. Taza, ever calm, raised a finger to his lips and pointed toward the shadows. "They are coming," he murmured. Her heart jumped. Outlaws, rustlers, or men fleeing justice, the frontier had no shortage of desperate souls. Clara's first thought was to run, to find cover and hope the canyon concealed her. But she had learned a valuable lesson from Taza's presence. Blind fear was more dangerous than any enemy. Observing, listening, and making a careful choice often mattered more than acting impulsively. Taza did not hesitate. With the quiet confidence of someone who knew every footfall of this land, he guided her into a small crevice between the rocks. The shadows swallowed them, yet Taza's calm radiated like armor. "Stay close," he whispered again, not a command, but a lifeline. Clara realized how much her trust in him was now a matter of survival. From their hidden perch, she saw the outlaws pass, 2 men, armed, moving carelessly, unaware of the ground's hidden eyes. They paused for a moment, arguing over the route, then disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Clara's hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline and the relief of survival. "You could have run," she said, voice barely audible. "Why didn't you?" Taza's eyes, sharp and steady, met hers. "Because the land teaches differently. Panic is dangerous. Observation is power." Clara's mind replayed the lessons from their long night of stories. Survival had always been about more than muscle or weapons. It was about listening, understanding, and choosing trust wisely. In that moment, she realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act carefully despite it. After the outlaws passed, Taza led her back to a safer clearing near the canyon's edge. The firelight now only served as a memory of warmth. They were surrounded by darkness, yet Clara no longer felt entirely alone. Something within her had shifted. She understood now that fear could not be a shield. It could only guide attention. True protection came from respect for the land, respect for others, and even respect for oneself. "Do you understand?" Taza asked softly. Clara nodded. "I think I do. Fear is only useful when it teaches you, not when it rules you." Taza allowed a small smile, fleeting but genuine. It was rare for him to show emotion so openly, and she felt honored by the trust implicit in it. The frontier had hardened him, yet he still carried patience. teaching rather than punishing mistakes. The long night of shared stories, quiet observation, and careful trust had reshaped Clara's perspective. She realized that not all dangers came from people or the land itself. Many arose from assumptions, from the stories one repeated without seeing the truth. Her shyness, once a defense, now seemed like an asset. It had taught her to watch and listen, to weigh risk and value, to notice when danger was real or imagined. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, casting a pale light over the canyon walls, Clara felt a sense of clarity she had never known. She had survived not because she was faster, stronger, or smarter, but because she had chosen trust wisely and allowed herself to learn. Taza, too, seemed lighter. Perhaps he had expected fear to dominate her, but instead, he had found someone willing to see beyond the surface, to learn from the land and to act with thought instead of instinct alone. That mutual understanding, rare on the frontier, bound them in a quiet, unspoken way. Part 4 offers an essential lesson for readers. Trust, when earned and wisely given, can be more protective than fear or aggression. On the frontier, life often demanded choices made in moments of tension, and courage was less about daring deeds than about measured decisions. Clara had discovered that her inner strength, shaped by caution, observation, and education, was the most reliable tool she possessed. As the canyon slowly brightened with morning light, Clara knew her life was about to change. She would carry this night with her, the memory of the long dark and the quiet warrior who had taught her that trust could save as surely as any rifle or blade. And though danger would come again, she now understood how to meet it, not with panic, but with awareness, respect, and courage born of understanding. The first light of dawn spilled over the canyon, painting the rock walls with soft gold and rose. The chill of night lingered, but it no longer bit at Clara's hands or shoulders. She felt a calm she had never known before, a mix of relief, understanding, and quiet pride. The long night with Taza had taught her more than she could have imagined, not just about survival, but about the land, the people who knew it best, and herself. Taza stood nearby, scanning the horizon. He was alert, but not tense. Clara noticed how naturally he moved, as if the desert itself flowed through him. It was easy to see why the Apache had thrived here for centuries. He knew the rhythm of the land, the hidden paths, and the signs of danger invisible to most settlers. "Ready to return?" he asked, his voice low, careful, as though even speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile morning. Clara nodded, gathering her shawl. She felt different than she had yesterday, stronger, more grounded. The fear that had clutched her in the canyon had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled her. She realized that courage was not always loud, nor did it need applause. Sometimes it was quiet, careful, and measured. The kind of courage that allowed someone to survive and learn. As they walked toward the edge of her homestead, Clara noticed small details she had never paid attention to before: the shape of the rocks, the tracks in the sand, the way the wind shifted over the canyon floor. Taza pointed out subtle signs: an animal's trail, water hidden under scrub, a patch of soil that hinted at recent rainfall. Every observation carried meaning, a lesson in listening to the land rather than dominating it. "You have learned quickly," Taza said, glancing at her with a hint of approval. Many settlers would not notice these things even after years. Clara smiled. She realized she had learned not only by watching, but by trusting him enough to accept guidance. Trust, she now knew, was not weakness. It was a tool as vital as a rifle or knife in the frontier. When they reached the boundary of her property, Taza paused. His respect for her space and for the land itself was evident. He would not cross the line. He would not impose. They had shared the night, but now the day required separation, as it often did in the frontier. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice sincere. "For protecting me and for teaching me." Taza inclined his head. "You needed only to watch and listen. You did more than most could." For a moment, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Then he turned, moving back toward the hills, a shadow among shadows. Clara watched him go, knowing she would not forget the lessons he had taught, not only the practical ones about survival and the land, but the deeper truths about courage, respect, and understanding. Returning to her homestead, Clara felt the weight of her new knowledge settle into her bones. She began to see the frontier differently, not as a place of fear and division, but as shared ground. The Apache, the settlers, the land itself, they were all part of a complex living system. Misunderstandings had caused much of the conflict she had grown up hearing about. Now she understood how education, awareness, and empathy could replace fear with understanding. Weeks passed. Clara used her new perspective to change small things in the settlement. She shared practical knowledge about reading the land with neighbors, encouraged careful observation of trails, and spoke gently about respecting the people and traditions around them. Her stories began to replace rumors and exaggerations, and soon others noticed. Life became not just survival, but cooperation. Even more remarkable, Clara became a bridge between her community and the nearby Apache families. Trading practices grew fairer, and cautious curiosity replaced mutual suspicion. She realized that sometimes the frontier's greatest danger was not in the wilderness or in armed men, but in assumptions and ignorance. Education, learning, and sharing was as powerful as any weapon. One evening, months after that long night in the canyon, Clara stood at the edge of her property once again. The sun was sinking low, painting the desert gold. She thought of Taza, who watched over his people and the land with quiet vigilance. She knew he would continue his work, and she knew she would continue hers. They had each learned from one another, and the frontier, harsh as it was, had room for understanding and respect. Clara felt hope, rare, solid, and enduring. The frontier had tested her, taught her, and reshaped her. She had faced fear, chosen trust, and survived. And now, the path forward felt full of possibility. Part 5 carries an essential lesson for readers. Trust, respect, and education can transform relationships and communities, even in the harshest environments. The frontier was not just a test of strength, but a school of life. By choosing careful understanding over panic, Clara had discovered that courage and empathy could shape not only her own survival, but the survival and harmony of the world around her. Weeks had passed since that night in the canyon. Yet the memory lingered in Clara's mind with a clarity that surprised her. The firelight, the quiet stories, the careful presence of Taza, all of it had reshaped the way she saw the land, her neighbors, and even herself. She had returned to her homestead a changed woman, but she understood that change alone was not enough. It had to be acted upon. Life on the frontier was rarely simple. Crops failed, storms struck without warning, and outlaws still roamed distant trails. Yet Clara noticed that small shifts could ripple outward. She began to approach her neighbors differently. Offering knowledge and insight she had learned from Taza, she spoke of reading the land, of paying attention to water sources, and of respecting both the desert and the people who had lived on it for centuries. At first, some settlers were skeptical. Many had been raised on stories that painted native tribes as obstacles, not teachers. But Clara's patience and quiet confidence slowly won them over. The more she shared practical knowledge, the hidden waterholes, the animal tracks, the safest paths across treacherous terrain, the more her neighbors realized the wisdom she carried. It wasn't long before she became a bridge between the settlement and the nearby Apache families. Taza's people were wary at first, as they had every right to be, but they noticed Clara's respect and willingness to learn. Small trade agreements followed, supplies for guidance, knowledge for protection. Rumors gave way to conversation. Misunderstandings gave way to collaboration. Slowly, the frontier began to feel less like a place of fear and more like a shared community. One afternoon, as Clara mended a fence near the edge of her property, she noticed a familiar figure emerging from the brush. Taza. He had come quietly, his presence no longer startling but comforting. He nodded, a gesture of recognition, respect, and perhaps unspoken friendship. "You've done well," he said. "The land is safer because of your choices." Clara smiled. "We've all learned something, haven't we?" He nodded. "Yes, that trust and respect can protect more than fear ever could." For a long moment, they simply watched the horizon together. The sun sank low, painting the desert in gold and crimson, and Clara felt a sense of peace she had never imagined possible on the frontier. Fear no longer ruled her. She had discovered courage, yes, but more than that. She had discovered the power of understanding, the strength in listening, and the joy in helping others learn as she had learned as the weeks turned into months. Clara and Taza continued their quiet partnership. They never rushed toward romance, nor did they need to. The foundation they had built on trust, respect, and shared knowledge was stronger than any fleeting passion. Through mutual understanding, they strengthened their communities. Trade grew fairer, disputes fewer, and both settlers and Apache found that cooperation rooted in education and empathy was the surest path to survival. The frontier remained harsh. It was still a place where storms came without warning, where misfortune could strike in a single day. Yet, Clara no longer saw it as a battlefield. She saw it as a school, a teacher with lessons written in every stone, in every track, in every whisper of the wind. And she had learned those lessons well. One evening, standing on a small rise overlooking the settlement, Clara reflected on how far she had come. She remembered the terrified girl who had chased a runaway horse through the canyon, trembling at every sound. She remembered the long night of stories, the quiet fire, and the calm presence of the Apache warrior who had taught her to see beyond fear. Now, she stood confident, not because danger had vanished, but because she knew how to meet it with knowledge, awareness, and courage grounded in respect. The frontier was still wild, but she was no longer overwhelmed by it. She had become part of it, in a way that honored both her history and the history of the land's first people. Taza approached her once more, this time with a small bundle of food and water for her homestead. "For the morning," he said. "A gift from my people." Clara accepted it gratefully. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He nodded, then turned to leave, but paused. "The land will guide you, Clara. Trust it, and it will never fail you." As he disappeared into the shadows, Clara felt hope bloom in her chest, steady, enduring, and real. She had faced fear, chosen trust, and built understanding where once there was suspicion. The frontier was not a place of final battles, but of ongoing lessons. And she was ready for all of them. That night, as stars blanketed the sky and the desert whispered in the wind, Clara lit a small fire on her porch. She thought of Taza, of the lessons learned, and of the path she would continue to W.